Good evening and welcome to the Tenement Museum. My name is Annie Polland. I'm the museum's president, and I'm so delighted to be here tonight with Nathaniel Deutsch, a historian of Jewish history, and we'll be talking about childbirth in the Lavine apartment and also more broadly on the Lower East Side and in Europe as well. We're excited to hear from you. We're excited to hear your thoughts and your questions and your comments. So please, if you're watching this virtually, feel free to write comments down in the chat and we'll get to them at the end. And also I want to extend a special welcome to our live audience over at 103 Orchard, just a half a block away from where we are at 97 Orchard Street. And you'll also will have the opportunity to write down your comments, and we want to hear from you at the end of the program. So I want to also thank the NISCA and the National Park Service, and all the wonderful organizations that help support the Tenement Museum. And especially I want to thank our members, because our members help support the museum in ways that make programs like this free for all of you watching online. So thank you for your donations, and thank you also for becoming members of the Tenement Museum and supporting the work that we do, both in the evenings and in the mornings and during the day. And what we're going to do tonight is we're going to kind of take a deep dive and look at an apartment that we talk about every day at the Tenement Museum. The Lavine apartment was created in about 2001, 2002. And it was created to tell the story of these people, Harris and Jennie Levine, or we can also call them Tzvi Hirsch and Scheindel Levine. They came to New York in around 1891, the summer of 1891. They had just been married, so they come here for a honeymoon. We know they come from Plansk, then part of the Russian Empire, now part of Poland. And they were two of, about 2.5 million East European Jews who left Eastern Europe and came to the United States. And as you know, so many of them settled on the Lower East Side of New York, and so many of them lived in tenements just like this. So whenever we talk about a family, we're also trying to extend and understand the broader context in which they lived. And now normally we talk about them, and we have our visitors situated in the parlor. Now, keep in mind this photo was taken by someone who could work for a real estate company, because they make the apartment room seem much larger than it is. When you're standing in there, it feels more crowded. This is the parlor of their home, and what's significant about it, and why this family was chosen to have an exhibit created about them in the first place, was that we learned that Harris ran a garment shop out of his apartment. So on the tour, we talk a lot in this parlor about the way in which the parlor was also constituted to help produce garments, one of the many, many garment shops on the Lower East Side that provided employment and a way to become American for so many of these immigrants coming over. But tonight, we're going to look at the bedroom. Nathaniel and I are now seated in the kitchen, but we're going to be talking about what would happen in the bedroom. We know that Jennie Levine gave birth to 5 children between 1892 and 1903. And we know for sure that she gave birth in the home. This was common, and we'll talk about that as well. We also know that each of her 5 children were delivered by midwives who lived in the neighborhood. And we'll talk a lot. You can see here the midwives' tools that might have been used. And I want to do a huge shout out to Lana Dubin, our curator, who reconstructed these bottles. And even the labels on the bottles come from prescriptions she found in a ledger that a midwife, Anna Michelson, had used. So everything we're doing here, and you can see on the wall the sheet of paper that's appended to the wall. This is an example of an amulet or a segula or shir lamalis, and we'll talk about that as well. That was a kind of a protection for the mother and the baby. And what you would also have seen in this video is a curtain around the bed, and we'll talk about that too as we get there. But before we talk about this bedroom, we want to talk a little bit about Europe. What was childbirth like in Europe? Then we'll hear about migration, and then try to put together what childbirth might have been like for Jennie Levine in this room. Okay, so that's my background. The other thing I wanted to say is we will talk specifically about her first baby, born August 25th, 1892. On the census, the baby's name is Pauline in 1900, but in 1892 on the birth certificate, it's Perel or Perla, and we'll talk about that as well. But I wanted to also share that in this building, between 1863 and 1935, 97 Orchard, where we are, over 200 babies were born. 219 babies were born in this building. So we often stand in the hallways and we say, imagine all the sounds of the tenement, the people going back and forth, and people carrying buckets of water, and the noises of children, the noises of mothers, the noises of fathers. The other noise you might hear is the sounds of childbirth. I mean, that's the reality of these spaces, and we kind of want to understand a little bit more about what that would be about. So let's start in Europe and also talk about Nathaniel Deutsch's research on ethnography. So we have on the screen a picture of Ansky, who was an ethnographer, but tell us a little bit about him and your work and why it's relevant to what we're talking about tonight.
Sure. So first of all, thank you so much for inviting me, not only to present tonight and to talk with you tonight, but also just to do the research that I did, to give me the impetus and inspiration to do that. Actually going into the bedroom here was like, it really sent chills down my spine, I have to say, because I did this research, and then the space was really transformed as a result of that. And you really do get a sense, I think, of what it might have looked like for a woman to give birth around the turn of the century in a tenement like this. So in terms of Ansky, for me, one of the things that interests me about this research was that I have done work on 19th and early 20th century Eastern European Jewish life. And then I've also done work on post-World War II Hasidic life in Brooklyn. So this turn of the century, Lower East Side Jewish, is kind of the space in between for me. And historically speaking, it's gotten, or I should say historiographically speaking, so in terms of what people have written about, it's actually been written a lot about. However, the focus has been on things like the Jewish involvement in the labor movement, for example, and other aspects of the American Jewish experience that are really moving away in a lot. I mean, that of course there was a strong Jewish involvement in the labor movement in Eastern Europe already, but it's part of the Americanization story, I should say. And one thing that hasn't been written about nearly as much is what were the kinds of practices, and we could call them folk practices, let's say, that were transported from Eastern Europe to the United States and that continued, or just as importantly, we could say that didn't continue. Within that, I think women's practices and customs, what are called minhagim in Hebrew or in Yiddish, around pregnancy and childbirth and taking care of infants are particularly kind of left out of the standard narrative of this period, because often they were seen as very private. They were seen as, obviously primarily involving women, and we'll talk more about that. That tended to be excluded from the kind of historical narratives that were written. And the sources that we actually have for Eastern Europe, I would say, are better than what we have for the Lower East Side at the turn of the century, which is interesting because we often think that it would be the opposite. It happened, what was going on in the small towns where a lot of Jews lived, the Shtetls in Eastern Europe, how could we reconstruct that versus New York, this big metropolis? In fact, when it comes to things like childbirth and pregnancy, I would argue that it's probably easier, at least it has been, to reconstruct that for Jewish women in Eastern Europe. But nevertheless, I think, were able to do so, to a significant degree, and that was an adventure in its own right. So Ansky, the reason why Ansky is up here is because Ansky, who some of you may know as the author of a play called The Dybbuk, which is probably the most widely performed Jewish play in history, then made into a really important movie. He was also an ethnographer. And between 1912 and 1914, he led an expedition into what was called the Pale of Settlement. This is part of the Russian Empire to which the vast majority of Jews were restricted, at a time when Jews were like 40 to 50% of the global Jewish population, the Jews in the Pale of Settlement. So super large Jewish population, also the source of a majority of Jews who immigrated to the United States during that period. So very important for understanding Jewish life on the Lower East Side in that period. He led an expedition. He visited 70 shtetls with a team of photographers, musicologists, etc. And he also created here we have an image of the team in one of the shtetls, and you can see them. They used early wax cylinder recording equipment to record songs and stories, hundreds of songs and stories, in fact. Ansky realized he wasn't going to be able to visit all of the hundreds of Jewish communities, so he created a questionnaire. Massive life cycle questionnaire. So beginning with what the soul does before it enters the body, and ending with what the soul does when it leaves the body, because that's really the traditional Jewish life cycle. You don't begin with your physical birth. Your neshama, as it's called, has to come from somewhere and enter your body. And one of the things that Ansky did, which is obviously super relevant for this event, is that he devoted tens of questions on this questionnaire to pregnancy, to childbirth, to midwives specifically, tens just to midwives. And he's a real pioneer when it comes to that. No one else had done that previously.
And wasn't this next to death? Wasn't this the most questions of any like life cycle or holiday or any other topic?
So if you look at the questionnaire, he has got a ton of questions about pregnancy, childbirth, and early childhood, a ton of questions about marriage and weddings, and then a ton of questions about death and dying. And those are the three, besides Jewish holidays, and he was going to devote another questionnaire just to Jewish holidays, which was actually never printed. But those three life cycle events, that's where we find the most customs associated with them. So the most Jewish customs. And so yeah, it's fascinating, and it's a window onto what childbirth was, one of the windows, because we can talk about others too, but what pregnancy and childbirth were like for Eastern European Jewish women back in the old country.
And if I remember correctly, the questionnaire was never actually distributed, but the questions themselves, because they weren't exactly open-ended questions, they kind of answered, like they would say, do you know this custom?
Exactly. For example, do you know a custom that when a midwife dies, all the people whom she delivered, obviously when they were babies, that they parade through the town holding lit candles in her honor? Well, clearly, and I've found other sources that mention that minhag, their custom. They're not asking like, does this custom exist, but rather, do you do it now? And often, frequently, did you do it in the past, and maybe you don't do it now because life was changing also.
And I think that's such an important point, because often when we give our tours at the Tenement Museum, for example, and we try to give background, why did people come? Because we're talking about so much dynamism here and so much change here, I think what often happens is Europe gets kind of a flat picture. Like Europe was like this, and then they came here and it was all these things happening. But one of the most important things about Ansky is that he realized that there was so much change happening in the shtetls that he had to record these. That was like the kind of like urgency of recording these customs, because they were also like disappearing, or people were moving to the cities, already in Europe before they even came to America.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, people who study ethnography will often categorize what Ansky was doing as a kind of salvage ethnography, meaning he was very acutely aware, and he wrote as much, he said it, including in the introduction to the questionnaire that we've been talking about, that life was changing in Eastern Europe for Jews, and that wars, in fact, he didn't distribute the questionnaire because of World War I. It erupted, and he was unable to do so. But even before that, the pogroms, the infamous pogroms, the most infamous, of course, being Kishinev, but there were many others, assimilation, modernization, immigration, all of these things combined to erode these traditional practices already by the time he's trying to put together this questionnaire and lead this expedition. So it wasn't like Jewish life in Eastern Europe was in amber, stuck in amber, frozen in amber, and things were dynamic in the U.S. Actually, things were very dynamic on both sides of the Atlantic, and nevertheless, some customary practices were maintained clearly in Eastern Europe, and it turns out in the United States as well, even though some also seem to have been left behind.
And let's take a look at. This is a portrait that you found of Sarah Greenbaum, who was a midwife in Plansk. And it's very likely that she was the midwife who would have delivered maybe both Zvihersh and Scheindel, or Harris and Jennie.
Right, or her mother.
Chaya.
Right, Chaya, exactly. So one of the things, so I mentioned different sources on reconstructing Jewish life in Eastern Europe. Ansky's work is a big, important source, but another super important source, what I call Yiskerbücher in Yiddish, these are memorial books. So these are books that almost exclusively, there's one or two exceptions, but almost exclusively produced actually after the Holocaust by survivors or by Jews who immigrated from different towns in Europe before the Holocaust to memorialize their now destroyed communities. And they're valuable even for 19th and early 20th century Jewish history. Why? Because many of the people would recall and write about people, figures, stories, aspects of life that they remember from when they were children. And that's the case here, where, and it's not uncommon, it's not that every book will have a photo and a story about the town midwife, but I have found other ones because they were really important figures in the town that people remember. And here we have Sarah Greenbaum from Plonsk, which is the town that both Harris or Zvihersh and Scheindel or Jennie Levine came from. Plonsk is a pretty small, kind of like a typical Polish Shtetl, a little bit north of, I think it's northwest of Warsaw. It's most famous, I would say, in the Jewish world for being the hometown of David Ben-Gurion, who I think was born in 1886. So he would have been a small child, maybe they knew him, who knows? Maybe he was delivered by her. I tried to figure that out, actually. So here we have this, photo, clearly, and in fact, she's written about with a great deal of respect. It's a trade she learned from her mother. It's likely that, certainly likely that had Jennie Levine been delivering her babies in Plonsk rather than in this tenement or even in this very apartment, she would have had Sarah Greenbaum as her abheim or babe. They call her an abheim here. So that was there are three terms that would have been used by the Yiddish-speaking Jewish immigrants anyway to the Lower East Side. One is a kusherka, which is a kind of fancier midwife, somebody who has technical training. Then you have a babe, which means basically grandma, and then abheim, which is another term.
And what's the distinction between abheim and was it also hebaim as well, or was that just a?
Yes, that's right. The difference between them is basically one is the technical. The akushika has, by the end of the 19th century, some Jewish women were getting training from basically medical training, and then the other two would be a woman who had learned from an older woman typically. Yeah.
And you see you see also these terms used in the Yiddish newspapers in terms of advertisements of midwives. Most midwives probably didn't advertise, but you see that used as well here. And then I wanted to also show, this was another image similarly from the Plonsk Yisker book of a cemetery at Plonsk. So what's the relationship between pregnant women and cemeteries? Because you usually don't think of these things together.
Yeah, so one of the interesting things about cemeteries in these Jewish towns, and I refer to them as Jewish towns, I mean, they're shtetls, there were Jews and non-Jews living together. In some cases, Jews might be a large majority, in some cases smaller, is that the cemetery was a really important site for religious practice, and especially Jewish women's practice. There were professional Jewish women mourners who people would pay during the month of Elul. This is the month of Elul right now. So it was very traditional to go to the cemetery and to pay one of these older women to lament the death of a beloved relative. And they were known to do this improvisationally. And that the better they were, the better they were at improvising, the more money they would make, basically. And they would, cry. And
so it was like a kind of theatrical,
Very theatrical, yeah. You would measure, another custom was measuring graves in using candle wick, and then cutting it, what you measured, the string, into wick for candles. In addition, people would go to cemeteries to invite their dead relatives to attend their weddings if they were getting married or if they were orphan. or if they were, for example, if they were going to or had given birth, to announce the birth of the child to their dead parent.
So it was a way of honoring those.
Exactly. Yeah.
And honoring with, I guess, an eye towards having them bless or watch over you.
That's right.
In
And
the present.
they were seen, or at least their souls were seen as being present in the cemetery, even after they had died. So there was a lot of interaction between the living and the dead in shtetls. And actually, spatially and even ritually, that's one of the biggest shifts that occurs when the immigrants come to the United States, is that rather than being in the center of the town, the cemeteries tend to be located way out in Queens or Long Island or whatever. And although there are still people who will go to those places, it's not nearly as easy, and it's not nearly as central in terms of Jewish life.
Because in New York,
Yeah.
Cemeteries were banned, as early as the early 19th century. Different streets were marked that you could no longer have graveyards or
That's right.
cemeteries. And
Yeah.
so by the time the Lower East Side is booming and it's a destination for East European Jews, the cemeteries are really located in Brooklyn or Queens.
Yeah.
or different places. And so we know that the Lavines were part of a group, Landsmannschaft/synagogue, that had a plot in Washington Cemetery. And it just wouldn't have been convenient to get on to travel at that point in the 1890s to Washington Cemetery or to other places. So you can see, like, geographically why this connection to a cemetery would have fallen off. However, at the same time, that desire or the connection one might have had to past ancestors or some super kind of protection that didn't, which maybe even made some of the rituals associated with childbirth all that more kind of important.
It's interesting to think about those two, the birth and death, being connected in different ways. And actually, if you Eastern European Jewish folk traditions, there's many more of them about commemorating the dead than celebrating the birth of, or I should say, commemorating the birth of somebody through, say, celebrating the birthday. That doesn't end up being there are a few communities, I think, where they do celebrate birthday, but in general, that is not a customary practice among at least modern Eastern European Jews in Eastern Europe.
The Jennie and Harris come in 1891, and we know that by, let me just see, here we go. This is an image of the midwife who delivered Pauline / Perel in 1892, whatever. And so this is like a hard piece of evidence we have about this childbirth that gives us information about the family, the ages that they were, and there's so many things to talk about. But again, we know that a midwife delivered the baby. Tell us a little bit about how Jennie might have found a midwife, or why also Jewish women in particular were using midwives. This was a time at the turn of the 20th century where there starts to be more change. There starts to be an advocacy for obstetrics and having a doctor deliver a baby. But for most of the people living in tenements, whether be they Jewish or Italian or Irish or Black in Harlem, right, that there's such a connection between women and midwives. But as you say, this is a time of change, so that's going to change.
Yeah, so really, I mean, one thing is that the end of the 19th century is a time of medicalization of childbirth. And that actually does occur on the Lower East Side as well. So in 1890, there's something called the Midwife Dispensary that's opened by two male obstetricians who are trained in Germany, which was seen as, like, at that time, the vanguard of science in general, but also actually obstetrics. And some of the women that you mentioned, the midwives who are advertising in the foreword, will, for example, mention that they are trained in Germany as a way of promoting the up-to-date kind of modern approach that they're taking. So this midwife dispensary, which is a little misleading, I don't know why they called it that exactly.
Because it was just doctors.
Yeah, because basically it is providing a service, which is doctors will go to women's homes. So it was not a hospital in the sense that women would give birth outside of their homes in a hospital, but rather that you'd have these medical professionals who are coming and checking on the women during their pregnancy and also delivering the baby. We know that close to 7,000 in, I think, between 1890 and 1900, close to 7,000 Jewish women enrolled with a dispensary. That doesn't mean that all their births were with the physicians from the dispensary. In fact, we know that in some cases they prefer to give birth with midwives, especially if there were a problem with the medical treatment they were getting or the difficult birth. They would then revert to midwives. Sometimes they would use both. There were something like 22 Italian women in the neighborhood who, granted, this was not the absolute center of Italian population, but it was close. There were quite a few Italian women.
Because I think where it was located on Broome was...
Yeah. So just those two populations, you see a big difference. So I guess the first thing I would say is there is medicalization. The second thing is that Jewish women are using modern medical practices more and going to doctors more than, let's say, their neighboring Italian American women. At the same time, many of them are going to midwives, and I think it is significant that Jennie Levine went to a midwife not just once, twice, all of her births, 3 different midwives, which we've already mentioned would have been different. It wasn't suggesting maybe that it wasn't that she had, I'm sorry, like if she were in Plonsk, she would have had this very close relationship, presumably.
And it seems like there would have been one midwife per town,
Exactly,
kind of. That was
at least, maybe a big enough town, you might have multiple, but it's more likely, right? So there was something about a midwife, not necessarily like a particular midwife, but that she preferred to go to midwives. And she went to, as I said, she went to 3. It turns out that the midwives themselves are from different parts of Eastern Europe, which is also interesting. I think one at least was from Romania, so pretty far away from where she would have been in Plonsk. That was one of the, I think that is one of the most important findings, that this is a woman who at a time when many other Jewish women are actually moving away from midwives, she was using midwives.
And one of the things that Lana, our curator, found was that of the babies born at 97 Orchard Street, 75% of them were delivered by midwives, right?
Okay.
So what we can do, we can go back and also check. My assumption is that after 1900 and especially after 1910, that's when you're going to see more of the shift to doctors, which I think at that point, by that point, started to represent being American, right? So that the Jewish women were connected. The idea of a doctor was that this is a more American way of doing things as opposed to old world. But in Jennie's time period and even in the years subsequent to that, the midwives were still extremely popular. And I think one of the things too is that I remember research I did a long time ago showed that the midwives, when the doctors came, they would charge like $15 and they would just basically deliver the baby.
Yeah.
Whereas the midwives would come and they would charge between $5 and $10. There was a range. But they, like for a 2-week period, were also helping to tend to the mother. Doesn't mean that they moved into the tenement, but they were here to help clean or help to like teach her things. Like that there was more of this like, okay, childbirth isn't just the delivery of the baby, although that obviously is core, but that there is this like transition to becoming a mother that this woman is kind of helping. And when you think too about how women like Jennie, now in Jennie's case, her mother had died before she came to Europe, but a lot of the women living in this building would have said goodbye to mothers, aunts, other people who might have given them advice.
That's right. I think that's an very important thing to bring up too, is that, and actually from the Jiskerbuch, the memorial book for Plonsk, there's another entry in the memorial book which discusses a woman who was living in Palestine, Jewish woman, in maybe in the 1920s or 30s, who went back to Plonsk to give birth because of the network of women. There was something, I think, with the pregnancy. It was a difficult pregnancy, or they anticipated it would be a difficult pregnancy. So she went back to live with her grandmother. And she talks about all the women being inside of the house with her when she gave birth, and the men being outside, which is a whole other aspect of this, the gendered aspect of it, and who would have been there, who wouldn't have been. In terms of what the midwives did, which a doctor wouldn't do, some of the advertisements will mention midwives who will give massages. I don't know if you recall. You looked at a lot of these newspaper
Or
advertisements
they were
too.
like in business with someone else, like two sisters, and one was a midwife and one was a masseuse. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. So there was like what's going on during the birth itself, what's going on before the birth, of course, and then but after the birth too. Yeah, and it's not, trying to get access to all of that is not so easy. I would say, because we don't have something like a Yiskerbuch, at least as far as I know, for the Lower East Side. But this is an area that you actually love.
It's. I feel like the Yiddish newspaper is like, I think, the closest way, and we've been looking at advertisements and other things to try to get a sense of things. Oral histories too, although by the time oral histories were done, often these were done in the 1990s with children of immigrants, right, born here. And one thing I want to bring up, because it has come up on tours, and also a huge shout out to all our educators who've been trying this material out, having learned from you, and are bringing this to life every day. Children, there was one oral history where a girl said when her mother gave birth, she had to wait outside on the fire escape of the tenement. And then when the mother gave birth again, she took her younger brother out onto the fire escape. And I think the first birth was in February, so she remembers it being very cold. So, like thinking about like how all of this is orchestrated, like there is the childbirth, and we'll get to that, but there's also just how is the family managed? How is everyone else managed? So let's actually start with Harris. Where would Harris be during this childbirth?
So everything we know about childbirth in Eastern Europe, Jewish childbirth in Eastern Europe, and also here, it indicates that the men would not have been present. That they would have been somewhere else. Whether he would have been outside of the apartment completely, it does seem like if it had been in, let's say, the Shtetl, he would have been outside of the house. Whether that was possible here, I wouldn't be surprised if he were outside of the apartment along with the other men. Whether there were other women, Jennie had a sister.
We know Jennie had an older sister who got here 20 years before she did.
And she had a large number of children, if I'm not
exactly.
mistaken.
I think she had like 8 to 10.
Right.
Yeah.
So somebody with a lot of experience who was closely related to Jennie.
And she might have recommended the midwife that they use for.
Perhaps, yeah. And we don't know. I mean, I've tried to find more about the midwife. She happens to also have been named Scheindel, right? Scheindel Knopfer.
Yeah, the first one was,
right. The first one, yeah. And I don't know whether was considered a Hebam, or whether she was, may have said Abheim before. I apologize for that. I confused the syllabi. But the syllables, rather. Or whether she was.
It'd be a fascinating class.
Yeah, like was she a trained midwife? Was she just an older woman? Unclear. So she would have been there. Maybe her sister. Maybe some neighbors. I don't know. And the Perel, who's the girl who's born, was named Perel. We see that on one of the sources that we do have are these. Is this technically a birth certificate or a certificate? It's
The recording,
right. So this is an amazing resource, And by the way, there are also sources like this in Shtetls. So in Eastern Europe, the town rabbi typically, or another Jewish official, would be expected to record the birth. Now, I would say that there's a difference, which is that many births are either not recorded, especially, at least there's evidence of this, of girls during some periods, or were recorded much later. So in terms of
back and
exactly, it's a hey, we just found out that you have a baby that you haven't recorded, and you can see birth certificates of individuals like this, where you say like, oh, I'm here to record the birth of my child from 4 months ago. And here are some witnesses that are accompanying me to testify to this. So I do think the records that we have here from the Lower East Side are probably more accurate than what we have from Eastern Europe in this regard. Although there are also, I would say, some mysteries here, because according to this, Jennie may have given birth to another child before. Right. And we've spent a lot of time figuring out whether there was another child, what happened.
Was there time for her to...
Was there time for her to have another child? Perel is their first, at least one that's recorded here in 97 Orchard. She's named after her mother, Jennie's mother, who had passed away a few years, just 2 or 3 years before. So we can imagine this was very meaningful. It was very common for Ashkenazi Jews to name their children after deceased relatives.
And this is an example of, even though the cemetery isn't here to go to, but there's still, like, through the naming, the invoking of the old
Very
soul.
important memorialization. Very important form of memorialization. Traditionally, you would not, unlike some Sephardi Jews who will name children after living relatives, Ashkenazi Jews would not do so. So this was a way of memorializing. We can imagine, especially her mother died right before she left, or a few years before she left.
And because of this just occurred to me, but, like, let's say there was another child who maybe died, could we then assume that child would have been a boy? Because if it had been a girl, that she would have been named Perel, right? Do you see what I'm saying?
I do.
Yeah.
I'm not sure.
It's interesting. It's like just a thing, thinking about this naming and how it can help us think about sequence and dating. But yeah, so this birth certificate kind of roots us here, thinking about Scheindel Knopfer, the midwife who comes. And we don't know how steep she is in rituals or any of this, but were rituals to enter into the birth that would be coming via the midwife or other women.
Absolutely. So, for example, tchinas. So there's a type of supplicatory prayer that were typically written in Yiddish. I think, here's an example. I think it's from 1837. Very well-known one from Eastern Europe, and in these were used by women for ritual purposes. I mean, women who were literate would both recite these for themselves, but also for other women who could listen to them. This is actually written by an akushika. So here we do know, because it's an akushika named Sarah. So a midwife wrote this, and actually I have many of the tchinas, these prayers, are for women who are either wanting to get pregnant or giving childbirth. And here's one that starts: "Ruler of all worlds, creator of all creations, author of all wonders, you created me from a piece of earth and lump of clay," referring, of course, to Genesis. "And now you have done the same in my womb. You have split open my body wondrously like you did the sea." And presumably it's the Sea of Reeds, right? "Indeed, or the Red Sea, I was in your hands the entire time. Accept my blood, my labor pains, and my weakened state as an offering and as a sacrifice, and return me to good health so that I can raise the child well."
It's such a beautiful thing, because there's taking something that is like, I think often people think of God, religion, spirituality as something very removed from day to day, or something physical, where this is like taking,
absolutely,
like reclaiming.
And the physical imagery is so powerful there too. I mean, it's in a way it's kind of classic midrash almost, in the sense that it's referring back to these biblical
and giving it that importance,
but
and
then very physical and present in this bodily way. And we don't know whether Scheindel Knopfer would have used tchinas, would have had a book with her, whether she would have. Apparently, she could write, because she did write. She filled out the birth certificate, or whether Jennie Levine would have wanted her to do that, or whether Jennie would have done that.
Maybe the sister had something.
Maybe the sister, yeah.
But it's interesting too, because these are moments where women have power over the scene. Like precisely, men aren't here, and the women around have the power of kind of like, a medical power to some extent, or not power, but medical skills. They have spiritual skills, like that these women are kind of like using the techina and other things to kind of show this connection to the world that is often seen as a men's world. But
that's right. Yeah. I mean, we typically, certainly in this period, think of these texts, Jewish texts, as being associated with men, but the tchina is really a genre that is typically associated with Jewish women, that was in some cases produced by Jewish women for this moment, this life cycle event that is exclusively for women.
And I want to talk again about some of these like objects that kind of made everything real. But before we do, I think it's important to note that you do in the wonderful essay that you've written for the museum, talking about how present in that room, right, might have been Scheindel or Jennie, might have been her sister Bessie, might have been, and certainly with Scheindel, we know, maybe some neighbors. But there also is in the room the fear, perhaps,
Yeah.
of the evil eye.
You know what? I love the way you brought this up because it's very much about who is okay to be there, who should be there, and who shouldn't be there. And among the beings who shouldn't be there are supernatural beings, certain supernatural beings in particular. The being you really don't want to be there is the supernatural being Lilith, who is probably the oldest continuous Jewish belief, insofar as it goes all the way back to ancient Mesopotamia, and it's likely that Jews inherited it or were just part of that ancient Mesopotamian culture, and were just a people who continued to believe in this figure Lilith, who in her original incarnation and up to the present day, because there are still Jews who do believe in this, is, for lack of a better term, a baby snatching demon. This is a demon whose sole purpose is to haunt and to try to kill women, but especially who have given birth, and their babies. And so we have certain what are called skulas, which is it's basically any kind of it's like an object that is used to make something good happen or prevent something bad from happening. Some skulas are, so for example, the pitom, the stem of the esrog, of the etrog, of this citrus fruit that you use on the holiday of Sukkot or Sukkot for ritual purposes, that is considered a skula if a woman eats it to get pregnant. Very common.
And so that was a good skula.
Yes.
I mean, they're all good because the skula is defending you.
Exactly. And then some skulas we are called kamiyas, which is basically like amulet. Okay. So here we have a skula. This is the most common skula to protect women and children. What's called a kimpetern, a woman who has just given birth in Yiddish, and her zoikind, her the nursling. So you call it in English. This is Shir Lamalas. Shir Lamalas Esaenai Elaharim. It's the first verses from Psalm 121. And you would take this and you would put it on, as you see, it's now back there. You can see it right there. On the walls, often people would put them on every wall. People still do this to this day. Some people, I was talking to a Hasidic friend of mine, he said they clip it onto the bassinet of the baby, one of these. This one was likely circulating at the time when Jennie would have given birth. It's from Eastern Europe. It was printed. They were printed in massive quantities. Often they would be printed on one side for a boy and the other side for a girl, because this one says Nikeva, which means female, girl. And then depending on what the child turned out to be, because you didn't know in advance, right? You would cut it, and then you would take it and you would put it up on the walls. And this protects against Lilith. And typically we'll have in the middle, it'll actually mention Adam and Eve, and the different forefathers and foremothers of the Jewish people, and then say, everybody but Lilith, and there'll be and sometimes they'll have the little cartoon images too.
And then there were like 3 angels too.
That's right.
To protect.
Right. That's right. So protective angels as well. This one doesn't have it, but a number of them do have it. So actually, Annie, you found it you found in some of the Jewish press, Yiddish press from the beginning part of the 20th century, found references to a Jewish bookstore. There were Jewish bookstores on the Lower East Side. Those are really important sources for not only learning about what people were reading, but also what the Judaica was, what they were doing, exactly, what ritual objects were there. And in one of the articles you found, it mentioned, oh yeah, you go to this bookstore, you go inside, you see the yarmulkes hanging, and then you see, of course, they have shir lamalas for women who have given birth.
So this is important because, again, a lot of what we're doing, thinking about Jennie's birth, is speculation.
Yeah.
Again, other than the fact that we know she had a girl, that we know that there was a midwife, we don't know which customs she used. But by being able to say, okay, but on the Lower East Side in these bookstores, it was common for this to be sold, helps us connect the dots.
That's the material culture. I mean, we can say that whether she specifically did it, we don't know in this case. but definitely there were enough women who were doing it that it would just be a natural thing to find in a Jewish bookstore.
And we found references also to, I think this is something you'd written, that another segula is to
That's
put
right.
a knife under
A
the
knife,
pillow.
yeah. So this was seen, and this one is actually inscribed with some Hebrew. Very common skula is a knife to protect. We find this actually not only in Ashkenazi but in Sephardi sources too, to protect against evil spirits. A lot of these skulas are also to protect against what's called the evil eye, the ayin hara, which is something that another article that you found mentioned explicitly. It says, well, everybody knows that children are more susceptible to the evil eye than everybody else. It actually says evil eye and basically witchcraft, kishuf, right? So everybody knows that. That's just like a given.
Right.
And why? Because they're these beautiful, young, full of hope, full of life. And that's what the evil eye likes to target. So one of the ways of preventing that was to have these amulets, but another way was actually to surround the bed in which the woman had given birth and where she was often sleeping with the child with some kind of protective drape.
Curtain.
Like a curtain, rather. Yeah, a curtain. And that would prevent people from looking, because the evil eye, as the name suggests, is something that could be cast if somebody looks at you.
And so this curtain, another reference we found to the curtains is in that other article. They also talked about that sometimes people put the shir lamalis on. I couldn't remember the word in Yiddish, but it translated into a Spanish, which is a term for like a what's the word, like a partition of sorts, a temporary partition.
That's right. Yeah. To try to create some kind of separation, visual to set off the space. But also visually to prevent people from gazing on it.
And I love this because, again, maybe Jennie, Scheindel, whatever we call her, maybe she didn't believe in the evil eye. Maybe not. And we can go back to that but I imagine that if you're living in a tenement apartment with more than 100 people, and you're giving birth, you want some privacy. Like, whether you believe in the evil eye or not, you're like, I want this curtain up. Like, I'm getting a little bit of a privacy for the first time maybe since I've come to this country.
Yeah, I found a source where a young woman had given birth. Not sure if I was in the Lower East Side or another Jewish immigrant community in the U.S., and she wanted to be modern. And so she actually rejected. They wanted to have a curtain, and she rejected. She said, I don't care. I don't believe in any of that stuff. The baby got sick. And then immediately they were like, you got to put up the curtain. And she agreed. And the baby did get better. Whether it was because of the curtain or not, we don't know. But anyway, so we can imagine a push and pull, right? Because there was such a strong impetus to modernize.
And to Americanize. And Americanize meant science. It meant but it's interesting. The other thing to think about is how different times of the year, different things that you're experiencing, you might be more drawn to it. In other words, you might say, you know what, this evil eye stuff, I don't need to think about it. And then you're giving birth, and you're going through this horrible and scary, and of course it was even more scary at the time, that you would then believe in something like that. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, these are moments when things like the belief in the evil eye, even if you're like, come on, that's just an old wives' tale or whatever. I don't believe in that. Where when push comes to shove, you may actually agree to have the amulet or to. And
while I have no proof that Jennie did any of these customs, I do have proof that the evil eye, or belief in the evil eye rather, crossed the ocean, because we did find a Yiddish newspaper article also that said the evil eye is alive and well in America.
And some of the memoirs written by women, there are a few of them about life on the Lower East Side, beginning of the 20th century, do mention evil eye. They also mention basically exorcists, both men and women, who people would go to. And women, one of the things that Ansky discovered was that women were much more popular as exorcists and as kind of healers, folk healers in shtetls in Eastern Europe than the men were. Which is an interesting question why, but that was. So we can imagine that carried forward here as well to some degree.
And the same reason that even generations later, even someone who's not Orthodox might not have a baby shower, right?
Yeah.
That idea, that concept of the evil eye is
Yeah,
also
yeah.
very.
I think
still
actually some of these beliefs associated with things like the evil eye are among the customs that survive the longest.
quietly in a way, but yeah.
I mean, by the 1950s, on the other hand, we will find Jewish women's childbirth in the U.S. almost completely medicalized.
And by 1920, part of it is by 1920, I think that's when more women start to give birth in hospitals. So
That's
you take
right.
this out of the home.
Including on the Lower East Side, they built a hospital for that. That's right. So it's initially more gradual, then it really kicks in. It's even before World War II, it's the transition is almost complete.
And I found an article also in like 1947 in the foreword that was about like, oh, the midwife, there's a few midwives left, but like
That's
we
right.
don't believe in midwives
That's
anymore.
right.
And it was like, again, taking great pride in doctors where 40 years earlier, there was an acknowledgement in the same newspaper in similar articles that like a lot of the times midwives actually knew better than the doctors at the time, that there was a kind of a certain faith in midwives, although there was a lot of disparagement of midwives as well too at the time. In terms of things that are changing, what's interesting is we have this book of Tenement that we talk about often in our Rogaszewski apartment, which is dated to the 19-teens. So, and this is republished in 1916,
right?
exactly. Yeah. And what's interesting, we were looking at this earlier, there's so many prayers, and then these are special supplications for women to kind of understand the prayer. So there's one that we've been looking at looking at the high holidays, and which is to explain why the shofar is blown and what you're supposed to be thinking about at that time. But there's nothing on childbirth in this. Like, this is covering so many holidays and other kinds of life cycles, but nothing on childbirth, which I think speaks to your point that there's a point at which this gets really kind of written out.
They must have consciously excised those tenements because those were standard in the Eastern European Jewish repertoire, basically, of what would have been published. What happens during World War I? The majority of the Judaica, or at least a very significant, depending on what it is, proportion of it is still being produced in Eastern Europe and brought to the United States. But World War I interrupts that. And so we start to see in a number of different genres things being produced in the U.S. for the first time, including also the Shir Lamallos, where they'll attach like a little bit of English phrasing, and maybe put it blue for boys, pink for girls, which you don't see previously as far as I know. This one, like 1916, okay, they just cut it out. I guess they thought that was either women wouldn't want to use it or they shouldn't use it.
Right, there's something
for whatever
this
reason.
Kinds of symbolizes the old world as opposed to other customs which were totally.
But then they have a trina for somebody in the U.S. who hears bad news
about the old country.
About the old country, right?
Which would have been pogroms and anything like that. So that they're updating it in certain.
They're
ways.
Updating it in some ways and cutting out other things.
Yeah, and there was another one, again, just because the high holidays are coming, the blowing of the shofar, of course, is the blowing of the ram's horn, which dates back to the time of the temple, and it's done on Rosh Hashanah to show the seriousness of what is happening and to help with this process of atonement. And the prayer for that in this book is all about, like, when you blow the shofar, Satan goes away. Like, Satan is here, kind of like, you can see Satan, evil eye, Lilith, along the same repertoire of people that you don't want around.
Yeah.
And that you have the shofar. It's almost like the shofar is a segula, or a kamiyah to move that away, a physical way of pushing away something that is evil or bad or that is harmful. I want to be able to show you a picture of Perel grows up, and we can see a picture of her. Now, I think at home is she called Perel or Perla, and at school is she called Pauline? Again, we don't know the answer to this question, but in this picture is taken in 1910. We know that because it's Max, who she's photographed with, is 13. It's like the year he has his bar mitzvah. And again, we always think it's significant that this picture is taken with the older sister and the brother, almost like what is the role she has in his life? Like how is she kind of almost like a junior mother to him?
And was she present at his birth?
Exactly. And was she in charge of the other? Hyman was another boy that would have been born in between. Was she in charge of watching Hyman while the birth was happening? And then we just wanted to kind of show again, this is Pauline next to the picture of Scheindel or Jennie that we showed. And again, we don't have a date for the photograph of Jennie, but based on what Pauline looks like in there, we've put Jennie, again, in my very scientific approximation, a few years older, like maybe 20, 21. So it's like when she gets to America. And it could even be that in that picture, we don't know, but maybe Scheindel is pregnant already with her. But you just see how much they look alike. But also to think about in the course of just 18 years, like how the world has changed, and how these customs and these rituals almost become ways for them to be negotiating that change and saying how they're going to do it. Because at the end of the day, it's not like a rabbi or, for that matter, an editor of a newspaper deciding which rituals Jennie is going to use. It's Jennie with her sister, and one last thing so we get Hirsch back in the picture, Tzvi Hirsch back in the picture, he would go to synagogue right after the birth.
Yeah, so the Beis Elul, the second day of Elul, which is the Jewish day that Perel was born, was on a Thursday. Actually, it's also my birthday, Beis Elul. So, yes,
but we don't celebrate birthdays, so I'm not gonna say anything.
So anyway, so it was a Thursday, and there's different traditions, but one tradition is that the Shabbos, the Sabbath after the birth, the first Sabbath after. Another one is when the Torah is recited, the first day the Torah is recited, could be Monday, Thursday, or Saturday. But in this case, it would have been Saturday in any case. The father of the baby would go to the synagogue, and there was a synagogue.
Hester Street and 61 Hester.
Right, Chochmas
Adam.
Plonsk, that was established by Jews from Plonsk, their town, in I think 1873. And he was a member of this, we know, would have gone there, and there would have been a prayer that would have been recited for the well-being, the health of the mother. It's called Mishaberach. And in that prayer, they would have announced the name of the baby girl. And presumably it would have been Perel. They wouldn't have called her Paula. They would have called her by her Jewish name. So that's when the Perel would have become known to the broader public.
Known to the Anshe Plansk, yes. There's so many more things to talk about, but we're running out of time. We're going to go to your questions. I want to also let you know in the audience that you can, to learn more about Ansky and Nathaniel's wonderful work and a translation of that questionnaire. This book is incredible. It's called The Jewish Dark Continent. It's available at the Tenement Museum bookstore, and I think you get like a $15 off, actually, if you type in the code that they'll tell you in the chat. And they will be signed and sent to you. So definitely read more because it's fascinating. I think it's one of my all-time favorite books to help understand the world and the culture. And I just wish there had been an Ansky to do the Lower East Side. But in the face of this, I think we're trying to stitch this together beautifully. We're also celebrating the high holidays at the Tenement Museum this year. You can come on Thursday night. You can come Sunday. I think it's sold out, and then the next Sunday. But I think Thursday night we still have tickets available to a special tour on the high holidays that actually takes you into the Lavine apartment. And again, Elul, Pauline is born on the second day of Elul, which is preparation. You're getting really ready for the high holidays in that time period, so you can learn about how the childbirth and high holidays connect. And each of those programs ends with, we had mentioned the citron earlier, a citron cake that comes from Hinda Amchanitsky's cookbook, first cookbook published in America by a woman in Yiddish, 1901. And you can learn about her and come on these programs. Also during the week, we'll have variations of these programs and the food tasting available. So please check out our, to kind of experience the high holidays in many different ways. It doesn't get you out of going to synagogue. If you need to go to synagogue, this doesn't count, but you get to learn more about the cultural background of what is happening. Let's go to questions. Chelsea, do we have any?
Prayers that were recited for that, were there certain practices, and then also how were things recorded? Was there an official record of miscarriages,
Great question.
and that morning side of things.
Do you need me to repeat the question in the microphone?
If you just want to summarize, or
Yeah.
just want to jump in.
So the question is about miscarriages and what do we know about how they were recorded, and also if there were any special rituals associated with it. And I'll turn that over to Nathaniel.
Yeah. I don't know how they were recorded in either the United States or Lower East Side or at this time or even in the various Shtetls. Whether they felt like you had to record them. We also don't know whether it was a miscarriage. We don't know whether there was
We don't know for sure, right?
Yeah,
I think just in general.
Yeah. There are a number. So there are legal, like, halachic questions associated with that, and so in halachic works you will find discussions about what to do, and then in Ansky also has some questions in his questionnaire about that. Where are they buried? Where are they buried? How are they buried? What do you say? And so on. So it is a topic that is treated in these different kinds of sources. Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't know the question for the records or the sources here. I was looking for that when I was looking through a midwife's ledger to see were there any markings of anything like this, and I couldn't in the one record of a midwife that is Anna Michelson's ledger, which is available at the American Jewish Historical Society. I didn't find records, although I haven't gone through the whole thing of
Yeah.
it. But I haven't found mention of it. In records I've looked
Yeah.
at, which of course doesn't, it happened. It's just a matter of,
Yeah.
again, it points, and maybe there's someone out there that knows more, likely so.
Actually, we can see whether he has some questions. Maybe while we're taking the other questions, I can
This sounds
just quickly
good.
look through. Yeah.
Excellent question. And I also don't know when they were marking whether there's been a child born or how many would they count that as a child, a miscarriage? Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And that might have been, that
Exactly.
might have varied depending on who the midwife was or whether the mother herself was sharing the information or counted it or not. Are there more questions?
Yes, and let's try to get
Okay.
we have a community of midwives who are watching over in
Oh.
level 3 together.
Hello, community of midwives. That's wonderful.
They were asking if you could talk a little bit more about the tools that the midwives would have brought with them that they saw in the film. Maybe kind of saw a little overview.
Yes, I don't know all the answers to that, but I think if I remember correctly from what Lana was telling me, a lot of this is like cloth. Like it's not like tools that, a lot of it was like pieces of cloth and strings. And I don't know much more than that. I do know that the medicines that were available were only medicines that she saw mentioned in the ledger. But I don't know much more. I do know in another case, in about 1906, 1907, Survey magazine, which is a magazine about social work, did a woman named F. Elizabeth Crowell wrote about midwives in New York and talked about looking in midwives' bags. And was doing this in a way, part of it was tendentious because part of what they were trying to do was talk about how you should move to doctors and doctors were better and there were so many midwives who were corrupt, and one of the ways they proved this allegation, or tried to prove this allegation, was by saying in the midwives' bags, a certain percent, I don't know if it was 25%, I can't remember now, but had tools for abortion. And I don't know what those tools were, but that was something else that would have been part of this time and this context.
And I think last question from the audience is, a lot of this is obviously emerging and new is what they're hearing, and they're very interested in specific sources that were shared tonight. Is there a plan for how we're sharing this research and everything in the future?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the idea with all of this is that we found this to be such a rich topic that we want to keep going back to it and try to find out more, and even then look at the rite of childbirth in Chinese families, in Italian families, and others, right? So how we can kind of use the apartments that we have and experts in other cultures to kind of help us gain a better understanding. In terms of how we share this out, the essay that Nathaniel wrote for us is one that's going to be part of a small book that we'll be publishing and available in our shop, hopefully within a year, that isn't just about childbirth. This is about just a range of rituals and holidays and things like that. But so we hope to make our findings available through publications, through programs like this, through our tours also. And to be honest, the questions you ask us, and I think this is what makes the Tenement Museum important and unique, I think, as a site of public history, is that we're really paying attention to the questions you ask us. And we're also really paying attention to, when we don't know the answers to things, how we can go research that and bring that back. And I think one of the things, and I think this is I love how kind of forthright Nathaniel is too about the historical process, is that there's a lot of times where you don't know exactly the answer and you're trying to kind of connect what you do know and bridge that to something else you know, and what's in between, and how do we fill this in. So I think you probably asked a specific questions of, can we share our sources with you? We're happy to talk to you in the room and tell you more if there's something specific you need to know, or if you want to write a question, we can get you specific sources. But your question I took as an opportunity to expand even broader about the historical process and how we're trying to approach that at the Tenement Museum. So thank you for that.
Here, by the way, are some questions.
Questions about
Miss.
okay, great.
So these are questions from Ansky's questionnaire that I mentioned. There are over 2,000 questions overall, and this is question 104. They're numbered. How does the burial of a child who's been miscarried take place? Do people wash the body? Do they bury it in the same grave as the mother, if the baby dies along with the mother, in the same burial shroud or in a separate one? If the child is male, is he circumcised before the burial? Traditionally, you would circumcise the child in that situation. With what is he circumcised? And where does the circumcision take place? Do people call him anything before the burial? Do they name him? And there's also, do they name the girl, child? There were traditions that you did. How does the cutting of the umbilical cord take place? What methods do people employ in order to expel the placenta? And so on. So these are questions also specifically if a woman dies during childbirth and the child. So he gets into real detail about these, these questions.
And the fact that it's posed as a question, again, it's like it implies that there could be different variations and practices.
There are, and one of the things I did actually in the book, if anyone takes a look at the book, is you'll see that in the note I annotated it. So I give notes to different halachic works, or what are called minhag books, where they discuss the origin and the practices of the origin of different customary practices, whether they're still engaged in, and so on.
That's great. And I think one last comment I have, if there aren't any questions, and I know those, please, I can comment. This is a playful question, but what do you think? When Ansky did this work, as you write so beautifully in your book, Ansky wasn't doing it just to collect for the sake of collection. I mean, he was doing that. What was behind his impulse to do this work? So
actually, one of the things I've thought a lot about in terms of connecting this work to my work on Ansky is that Ansky wrote very explicitly that his goal was something that he called in Yiddish Aufleben, which it really is Renaissance or revival. He thought that by collecting, documenting Jewish customs, those that had already disappeared, those that were in danger of disappearing, or in some cases those that were continuing, at least in some communities or families, and then repurposing them in different ways. He created a Jewish museum in Petersburg. He wrote plays, as I've already mentioned. He wrote the Dybbuk. He wrote short stories. He was incredibly eclectic and creative person. In all of those things that he did himself and that he encouraged others to do, was to create a new Jewish culture, a vibrant, living Jewish culture that nevertheless was rooted in tradition. And so I think he would have loved this. That's the endorsement we need. Ansky would have loved this. I can't speak for him, of course. But well, maybe we can find the kind of place that a medium that will help us connect. Exactly. Yeah. But I'm sure he would have put his 2 cents worth in too about how things should be staged and everything. But I think this was exactly the kind of thing that he not only endorsed, but he walked the walk. I mean, he tried to do himself. And so that was one of the things that interested me in participating in this. And that, I guess, to that point, right? You viewers, if you're still here, if you haven't left as we've gone over, that you're a part of that, right? You're asking the questions, helps bring all of this to life. So thank you. Big shout out to our educators who are doing this every day. A big shout out to Lana Dubin, who did so much great work curatorially.
Also to Lana Dubin's grandmother, who wanted us to make sure we note that Lilith also is not that she's been reclaimed in the 1970s, and so we can understand Lilith in a much more positive light as well. So I wanted to throw that in for Lana's grandmother and others, and want to again thank all of you. Thank Chelsea. Thank Jacob. Thank. Eric, who's here with us in the room making this happen. Thank all of our friends over in 103, everyone at the shop making this happen. And thank you for watching. And please become a member and come visit us. Thank you so much. Have a good night.
Thank you.